So hello, and thanks for joining us, and welcome to the National Adaptation Virtual Climate Displacement Forum hosted by EcoAdapt. I'm Molly, one of the forum organizers and your organizer for today's panel on policy considerations at multiple scales. So for those of you who are returning to the series, welcome back. And for those who are just joining us, I just want to housekeeping rules to ensure a successful webinar. To help us reduce feedback, please place your telephone, cell phone, or computer on mute, even if you are using the microphone voice over IP option. Please use the question function on your control panel to submit any questions to the presenters throughout the webinar, and we'll have time for Q&A at the end. Please also use this question function to report any technical issues you might be encountering. We'll be recording and posting this webinar on the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange for future viewing, so it should be available online next week and can be viewed at kx.org. The slides and presenter information are available for download in your Handouts tab. You should find that on your control panel. And finally, throughout this series, we've been compiling recommended resources on climate displacement for attendees and the larger adaptation community. So you can make suggestions to the resource page by following the link in the chat box. And we're going to close that tomorrow, and we'll review it and then be sharing it with the larger community. So we appreciate your input on that. Next, I do want to quickly acknowledge that there are many people across the U.S. experiencing immediate threats to their lives and livelihoods due to climate change impacts. So this series is intended to provide a holistic view on climate displacement. I cannot be representative of all the people and communities working or facing this issue. So we encourage you to share about your work and your experiences in the chat or in the question function, and as well as on our virtual networking platforms. And we also want to thank you for attending today despite all of the challenges and uncertainty due to the ongoing pandemic, as well as the current election. So I'm pleased to introduce our panelists for today. We have with us Dr. Carlos Martín. He's a senior fellow in the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center at the Urban Institute. We have Katie Spidalieri, who's a senior associate at Georgetown Climate Center. We have Micah McMillan, who's a senior analyst in the Natural Resources and Environment team at the U.S. Government Accountability Office. And with him, joining us for our Q&A portion is Joseph Thompson, who's Assistant Director of the Natural Resources and Environment team at the U.S. Government Accountability Office. We also have with us Dr. Bronen, who's the co-founder and director of the Alaska Institute for Justice, as well as Don Antrobus, who is the Climate Change Adaptation Program consultant at the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium. So with that said, I'm going to pass it over to Micah to get us started.
Thank you, Molly. I appreciate it. And thanks everybody at EcoAdapt for giving us the opportunity to present. I'm just going to start off giving a little bit of an overview of GAO's body of work on climate change, and then I'll move into our recent work on climate migration. So GAO is an independent, nonpartisan agency working for Congress that investigates how the federal government spends taxpayer dollars. Our work is done at the request of congressional committees or is mandated by public laws or committee reports. And we generally provide Congress and the public with information that can be used to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of government and to save taxpayers' money. Our climate change work is cross-cutting across all of our 12 mission teams, but it's primarily run out of the Natural Resources and Environment team that Joe and I are part of. Next slide. Every 2 years, GAO issues the high risk list, a list of programs and operations that are high risk due to their vulnerabilities to fraud, waste, abuse, and mismanagement, or that need transformation. Climate change was added to the risk in 2013 because of the federal government's fiscal exposure due to the impacts of climate change. And we've identified 5 key areas as a part of that we've included on the high risk list. federal insurance programs, disaster aid and resilience, technical assistance, the federal role in strategic planning, and federal ownership of property. Our next update of the high-risk list will be released in 2021. GAO has issued 10 reports on climate change over the past year and has 12 more underway across the different mission teams at GAO. Topics include infrastructure, natural disasters, economic costs and opportunities, climate migration, tribal issues, and nuclear waste and Superfund sites. Next slide. Our recommendations have primarily focused on two key areas of addressing climate risks: mainstreaming by integrating climate change preparedness and resilience in all federal activities, and creating new institutions to address large-scale projects that cut across agency missions and pose fiscal exposures larger than one agency can manage. Next slide. In the fall of 2019, we published a framework that identified principles that can be applied to any federal disaster resilience effort to help federal agencies and policymakers promote and facilitate disaster risk reduction. The framework focuses on three key areas: access to information on risks and risk reduction strategies that is authoritative and understandable, integrated analyses and planning to help take coordinated resilience actions, and incentives to help make forward-looking risk reduction investments more viable and attractive among competing priorities. Next slide, please. To conduct our work on domestic climate change migration, we conducted a review of relevant literature to identify case studies and experts, and also interviewed federal officials from key agencies. We only identified a handful of communities that have actively considered climate migration as a resilience strategy. And from the communities we identified, we selected Newtok, Alaska, Santa Rosa, California, Ile-de-Jean-Charles, Louisiana, and Smith Island, Maryland, based on geographic and demographic diversity, as well as diversity of potential climate impacts. Only Ile-de-Jean-Charles and Newtok decided to move forward with the relocation because their climate threats are imminent and existential. Ile-de-Jean-Charles has lost 98% of its land mass since the 1950s due to sea level rise, storm surge, and unsustainable oil and gas production practices, among other factors. And the DENALI Commission projects that Newtok will be uninhabitable within the next few years due to thawing permafrost and coastal erosion. We found that federal programs generally provide limited support to climate migration efforts because they're generally designed to address other priorities beyond migration. Because no federal agency has the authority to lead federal assistance for climate migration, support for migration efforts has been provided on an ad hoc basis. And as a result, federal programs don't have the scale or level of continuity necessary to assist communities with migration. In 2016, an interagency working group on managed retreat and relocation was created to help determine the federal role, but it was disbanded in early 2017. Next slide, please. So overall, little is known about how federal programs should be changed or if new programs should be created to assist communities with migration. And based on our work, we found that project management best practices and recommendations from the National Mitigation Investment Strategy have said that pilot programs can be an effective tool to test new policies and assess lessons learned before scaling them up to the national level. And sort of based on those findings, we recommended that Congress consider establishing a pilot program with clear federal leadership to identify and provide assistance to communities that express affirmative interest in relocation as a resilience strategy. Next slide, please. We also identified several key factors for decision-making on climate migration. The first factor is community-led planning. Socioeconomic, cultural, and political connections to a geographic region may be strong, and it makes it difficult to consider migration as a resilience strategy. And we found that community-led groups that facilitate strategic planning can expedite progress and build public support for climate migration. The next factor is the capacity and access to funding. Moving an entire community requires technical expertise that many local communities do not have, and the overall cost of these communities can be prohibitive, and communities will need to pull federal, state, and local funding from programs with differing requirements and selection criteria. The third is coordination across multiple levels of government. Funding decisions are often made by different agencies at the federal and state level that often have differing priorities. And zoning and planning decisions are made at the local level. Ultimately, whether it is community decides to remain in place or relocate, there needs to be coordination and agreement across all levels of government. The next is public services. Loss of revenue can impact a community's ability to provide basic services as it gradually migrates. And receiving communities may not have the capacity to provide services to the migrating population. This is a particular concern in rural and low-income areas similar to Newtok and the Ile-de-Jean Charles. And as communities relocate, they'll need to be in a position to provide basic services in receiving and migrating communities. Next slide. Thanks again for the opportunity to present, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Micah. And yeah, at this point, we'll welcome Carlos. And if you have any questions for Micah, please send them to the questions function.
All right. Well, thank you, Molly and Micah, for giving me a good intro to the topic that I'm going to cover, which is the federal policy framework for climate migration. But as Micah mentioned, my job is easy because there is none. There is no formal federal policy framework around climate migration. Rather, what we have right now is a patchwork of policies, some of which directly encourage movement, directly discourage movement, and a lot of programs that indirectly encourage movement and displacement. So none of these are readily transparent, and there are many reasons for this. Next slide, please. For starters, there are different kinds of movements that occur. We know that disaster-specific acute-related climate disasters have a tendency to create evacuation, relocation, and temporary displacement, sometimes which becomes permanent displacement and resettlement. There are also formal relocation programs, primarily examples and pilots that Micah mentioned don't really exist. There have only been a few of those cases. And what we see is more specific buyouts, acquisitions, land conversions related to specific economic needs for the public sector. Property abandonment is also a key issue, and making sure that places that are no longer viable from either an environmental standpoint or an economic standpoint encourages displacement. And finally, this issue of livability. So economic viability, should be much more on the livability side, and where the people are compelled to move as migration patterns have occurred throughout this country's history. So each of these is actually shaped by very different policies, different agencies, and program roles. Next slide, please. So the first one I want to talk about more significantly is the one that we see the most. It's the largest and most visible and most measurable, and the one that can be most directly attributed to an event that can be correlated to climate change, and that is disaster relocation and displacement. As Micah mentioned, there's a lot of our climate-related policy in this country that is built off of disaster management policy rather than environmental goals and social goals and approaches or foundational policies. We really rely heavily on disaster management for the time being. So this frames all kinds of decisions, from state and local intervention, the role of state and local government, community planning, resident safety nets, etc. So 2 quick points. States' roles are very important when we talk about disaster management. Some positives around that is that they could take a regional view about displacement and movement and housing and other services that have to occur. But the focus relying on disaster management and disaster events to dictate climate migration also generally means that we're excluding chronic effects of climate change, like sea level rise, heat, drought, permafrost thaw, flora and fauna transitions, etc. In many ways, there are several direct programs that relate from the federal government to climate migration. So we've already talked a bit about FEMA. The safety net tends to focus on evacuation, shelter, temporary housing assistance that could lead to permanent relocation. There's also a National Flood Insurance Program, which historically encourages rebuilding in potentially sensitive areas, including flood-prone areas. But given recent reforms, there's a transition that's occurring there. There are FEMA buyouts that our colleagues at National Resource Defense Council have done a tremendous job of covering and looking at how those lead to movement, voluntary movements of peoples. SBA and HUD have historically played large roles when it comes to property level and disaster recovery. And in many cases, these only occur, in most cases, these only occur after large disasters in which HUD gets appropriations. And in only 2 cases have HUD grantees looked at the newcomers, people who are moving over from other disasters. This was in Katrina and in Texas, and with Maria in Florida. And so trying to address their community planning goals with these newcomers. In almost all cases, both SBA and HUD and some of the other FEMA individual assistance programs really focused on rebuilding in site, so encouraging people to stay where they had just gone through a disaster. Next slide, please. So when we're focusing on federal disaster policy, it's also important to think about, as Micah mentioned, most land use decisions, most things that happen are actually occurring at the state and local level. So federal government rarely has the opportunity to determine what happens at the state and local level in terms of land use planning, demographic changes, etc. The exception is in these disaster scenarios. And so there, in this role, government constitutionally has much more authority than they may have had in other situations. I've showed this map just to reinforce the idea that migration that occurs often is typically very local. We've seen in the past webinar episodes in this series sort of the longer term projections, but when they're disaster related, they tend to be very localized. And so state and local government tend to dictate the housing markets. They tend to create the local policies that affect that. In the disaster funding scenario, there are opportunities to incentivize comprehensive planning and affect state and local migration with those federal dollars. There's also an opportunity to regulate private property uses, and private property is essentially all housing and shelter in this country that can inform people's decisions about moving or staying in place. So through the various block grant programs, the rules that dictate movement in federal assistance, like the Uniform Relocation Act, residential anti-displacement assistance plans, and fair housing rules, there are opportunities to shape what the pattern of migration would occur in those state and local contexts. Of course, we're facing a different mitigation world now with HUD, CDBG, MIT, and FEMA's BRIC programs that can be a little more incorporate a little more comprehensively what planning should do in terms of future changes. But right now, on the whole, federal government is limited in terms of its ability to shape local and state decisions, except when it comes to these big disaster dollars and when it comes to big long-term community planning dollars. 2 exceptions. Next slide. The first exception is federally owned land and infrastructure. So this is particularly important when we're talking about critically exposed land like coast and federally owned projects like dams, levees, storm gates, seawalls, etc. Typically, infrastructure investments are as blunt an instrument as disaster policy. Federal government agencies, particularly the Army Corps of Engineers, often drown out local household level needs, except for when they're dealing with specific property acquisitions related to infrastructure development. And there's limited, unclear interactions between those kinds of defensive adaptation, infrastructure protections, and other mitigation strategies, for example, individual personal insurance, household insurance, etc. So their federal role has a very heavy hand that's not quite explained for individuals' protections. There's also inconsistent criteria for those kinds of investments, as we've seen from the environmental justice, climate justice communities, deciding what communities get protections and which do not, and the questions about why us and not them are going to continue when it comes to these kinds of infrastructure projects. Next slide, please. I'm also particularly interested in all the federal rules, laws, and programs around individually owned properties. I think this is probably one of the most, and this is not in a non-disaster context, that indirectly shape local land use and patterns. I think these are particularly really interesting. So again, these are non-disaster related programs, so not the NFIP, and FEMA-related potential for migration. Things like housing finance, the fact that we have mortgage securitization and federally, right now, currently federally managed government, GSEs, governmentally enterprises that undermine their own, that are currently studying their risk regarding specific climate changes, but still have these on the books, and the federal government is still the backstop for them. In housing, we also have new rules that HUD has applied to that started again in the 2017 years after the Trump administration eliminated the federal flood standard, reapplying these to a variety of HUD programs, including multifamily and single-family loan insurance. You also have, if you think about the broader scope of federal agencies, things like EPA regulations on water and air quality and stormwater treatment that make certain places tenable. So we're looking at the federal role in dictating how much requirements are with specific kind of assistance, but also how these things dictate whether a place is tenable anymore. So there's a much wider range of federal policies. And if you look at the connection between every federal function, I mean, there are a variety of ways in which this connection occurs. Department of Labor and Treasury incentives for economic development funds and workforce training in certain places. USDA and HHS's safety net for food, income, and energy that encourages people to stay in place. Incentives by, even you think about the National Endowment for the Arts, National Endowment for Humanities, National Park Service that encourage specific historical assets and cultural productions to be place-based. So in many of these ways, most of these instances show that there's encouragement in the federal government for people to stay in place, and only a couple of cases in which they're encouraging movement. Next slide, please. But there are a couple of things that we need to be aware of in the federal government, and that is the federal agencies work very much as silos. So in all of these programs, the triggers and eligibility are different. Community engagement requirements vary widely. Each program has a very different total appropriation, how much they then disperse to specific grantees and state and local governments. Their timeframes are all over the place in terms of implementation. And I haven't mentioned the two biggest elements, which are one, how much the federal government actually, what the federal government can do budgetarily if we're looking at a variety of ranges of reform for all of these programs. And there's one agency that I didn't mention, that's the State Department. We haven't talked about international immigration as it affects domestic climate migration. And then third, there's another point that I want to be clear about, that the federal agencies, because there's so many different federal agencies, those mirrors of silos often play out at the state and local level. So I'm particularly excited to hear from the next panelist, Kate, to talk a little bit more about some of these, the ways in which this plays out locally. But before I go, just to sum up, there is no federal policy framework, formal federal policy framework for climate migration, but there are a whole lot of informal and formal ways that the federal government encourages migration and encourages people to stay in place by making certain places viable places to live. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Carlos. Now, welcome, Katie.
Thanks so much, Marley. Oh, no, can you hear me?
Yep, hear ya.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. Thanks so much, Carlos. So this is a really natural sort of transition in the discussion to look from managed retreat at a federal perspective to moving things down to the state and local policy-making level. I work at Georgetown Climate Center, and we serve as a climate law and policy resource for states and communities confronting impacts from climate change and also mitigating different emissions from climate change. We're affiliated with Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Next slide. So to this group, given the work that you all do and what's been covered throughout the climate displacement series, it's no surprise that rising seas and increasingly frequent and intense weather events are leading many coastal communities to confront the question of whether or not managed retreat is a potential adaptation strategy that sort of suits their needs and is something that they would consider. Georgetown Climate Center this summer released a new online resource called the Managed Retreat Toolkit, and it's the first comprehensive online legal and policy resource on managed retreat. The toolkit combines legal and policy tools, best and emerging practices, and case studies to support peer learning and decision-making on managed retreat and climate adaptation. With the toolkit, we recognize completely that managed retreat is not always going to be the best or preferred strategy in a community, or even something that makes sense based on a variety of factors like political will, funding, or community support and culture and history. But with the toolkit, we're really aiming to try and fill an informational gap that we've heard from practitioners and community stakeholders to bring more support for interdisciplinary and nuanced discussions around managed retreat, acknowledging that managed retreat is and will probably continue to only be one part of the coastal adaptation solution set, where we'll continue to see communities that have sort of broad strategies that also incorporate more traditional protection strategies like hard armoring or levees, and also accommodation approaches through the elevation or floodproofing of structures that will also play a role. Under the best of circumstances, we put forward a definition in the toolkit that really thinks about sort of the beginning and endpoints of managed retreat and sort of facilitating transitions between the tools. So we use a definition that managed retreat is a coordinated process of voluntarily and equitably relocating people, structures, and infrastructure away from vulnerable coastal areas, and also facilitating transitions for people, communities, and ecosystems to higher ground or areas further inland. In practice, however, as the series has demonstrated, managed retreat is an inherently complex and very challenging subject for state and local governments and communities. Everything in this toolkit is really intended to make it easier for state and local decision makers and the communities they serve to have these challenging and difficult discussions so that way they can hopefully make better decisions for the benefit of all. The primary audience of the toolkit is really state, territorial, and local coastal policymakers. But the idea with the toolkit, as we're seeing with new types of flooding, including from heavy precipitation events, a lot of the tools that we put forward could also be applied in a further inland area, and also a lot of inland areas are going to become receiving communities, so it could really apply outside the coastal context as well. Next slide, please. So what's in the toolkit? So the toolkit contains 8 total sections that present different legal and policy tools state and local coastal governments can evaluate to potentially implement broader managed retreat strategies. The first of these 8 sections is an introduction that tells users how the toolkit is organized and how they can use it depending on their individual needs. The section also importantly includes an acknowledgement section that lists literally dozens of federal, state, local policymakers, experts, and community stakeholders who inform this effort. The bottom line is this toolkit was developed hand in hand with all of these groups of people, so that way it would be useful to them on the ground. And we also maintain it as a living resource. That's why it's available in an online format, so we can look to update it with new tools, best and emerging practices, and case studies as this very evolving field moves forward. Next slide, please. So the other 7 sections of the 8 in the toolkit break out into 2 other categories. So the first is what we call 5 tools sections that identify the different legal approaches that jurisdictions can consider adapting to meet local need and context around managed retreat. These include the 5 different sort of overarching categories of tools you see on your screen, from planning, thinking about infrastructure, acquisition, voluntary acquisition of private property, regulatory tools, state and local decision makers can think about selectively choosing individual tools or applying a more comprehensive suite of tools depending on sort of what their local context and needs are. The final 2 sections of the toolkit are what we call cross-cutting sections on legal and policy considerations respectively. These sections really present a deeper dive into topics that cut across all or most tools and really deserve sort of a specific attention within the toolkit to promote more comprehensive legal and policy decisions. For example, one notable cross-cutting legal question that we talk about in the cross-cutting legal chapter is how governments can look to minimize potential regulatory taking from property under both the 5th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution and state analogs. Similarly, the cross-cutting policy section looks at 4 areas. So first, how can state and local governments look at funding managed retreat strategies, particularly when it comes to acquiring property voluntarily, private property, and also making investments in receiving communities and community engagement processes. And this looks at federal, state, and local sources of funding, both in a pre- and post-disaster context, and also more sustainable sources of funding that we've seen through some of the case studies we've captured. In addition, there's a section on how you can restore coastal ecosystems and facilitate inland restoration for the ecosystem part of retreat, how communities can be engaged through equitable processes, and how, lastly, it's important to plan for and make investments in areas that this series has covered that we call sort of receiving communities or receiving areas where people may choose to relocate away from the coast. To go into everything in the toolkit today. There's a lot of important information there, but I just want to pause and sort of go through 5 key takeaways that sort of have this cross-cutting element across the different parts of the toolkit. So first, by definition, managed retreat starts with planning, and that takes time. And that's really sort of the managed part of the terminology that we use, although we also have an entire session on the terminology issues around managed retreat. We've really designed the toolkit to provide tools so that way policymakers and communities can start decisions now before they're forced to leave their homestead communities. Second, managed retreat is complex and inherently interdisciplinary. Preparing to move out of harm's way really requires public work, financial and fiscal strategy, and particularly inclusive, open engagement with people in the communities affected. It can also involve everything from land use planning and infrastructure realignment or disinvestment to natural resource science and management, and understanding of both the implications that I mentioned for both coastal communities where people may be moving away from the coast, receiving areas where they may be going. This will require that policymakers, non-governmental partners, and community stakeholders across different agencies, levels of government, sectors, and areas of expertise really work together from the outset of these climate adaptation decision-making processes where all potential options are on the table to better navigate the complexities of managed retreat with the hope of minimize the various costs and maximize the various benefits for the different stakeholders and constituencies. Third takeaway to think about is that the successful development and implementation of managed retreat strategies must be inclusive. In our next speakers and through other sessions of this forum, you've heard that the bottom line of managed retreat is that the people who live in the communities affected are authentically, openly, and meaningfully included in the decision-making process from the start. There's little hope of achieving outcomes that are fair and successful. The decision of whether or not to retreat must start with and be led by effective communities. Any potential strategies and community engagement and planning processes need to be adapted to trusting coastal communities where it doesn't already exist, which can be a long-term process that you have to gain and then maintain, and also to address historical and racial inequities where they exist to create and implement truly equitable processes. Fourth, hazard mitigation buyouts, which several presenters throughout the series have talked about, and often if you see like the media, are one of the tools or the tool that's most synonymous with the concept of managed retreat, and some people even associate managed retreat only with hazard mitigation buyouts. While it's an important tool that has been used and will continue to be used more in the future, it's important that state and local policymakers and communities recognize that hazard mitigation buyouts are not the only tool in the solution set that they can, and maybe something else would be better adapted to fit local context and needs. In the toolkit with those 5 tool sections that we have, it's really important to have policymakers educate themselves on the range of opportunities so they can sort of make the best decisions in their communities. And another point I think it's important to highlight is the fact that a lot of discussion around managed retreat talks about how to reinvent the wheel. We've never done this before, but in a lot of places it has been done, particularly if you look at hazard mitigation buyouts in the Midwest, and now it's sort of being translated in more of a coastal context. So for example, local governments have a lot of tools already at their hands. So local governments have local comprehensive plans, which are often called master plans or general plans that establish land use and zoning at the local level. And they also have land use and zoning tools like overlay districts, where they can discourage development in vulnerable coastal areas and also increase density in higher ground, safer areas where they think people could move or transition or they could become receiving communities. So it's not always about reinventing the wheel, but what do we have in place? And then that could sort of dedicate limited resources to where advocacy or sort of innovation might be needed. Finally, I just wanted to pause and say that comprehensive managed retreat strategies must be about more than just helping people walk away from vulnerable coastal areas. Policymakers also have to think about 2 important things. First, how can they put laws and policies in place to help people transition to safer areas to minimize the social, psychological, and economic costs of relocating? Notably, governments can really think about, if there's enough data on the table and information where they can identify themselves as a receiving community, can they make proactive investments in things like affordable housing, critical infrastructure, and critical services like schools to help accomplish those goals, and also seek to avoid displacement and gentrification in receiving areas where we're seeing that in some areas. In addition to thinking about where people are going, policymakers should also think comprehensively about what's being left behind, namely in the environment and people who cannot move or who choose not to move in the communities that they're leading. People in coastal communities could have the benefit of ecosystems that are restored and conserved to do a myriad of things like reduce flood risk, or areas could be turned to open space or passive recreational amenities that can enhance their life in the community if it's safe for them to be there, or potentially prolong their ability to stay there. In addition, there's natural resource benefits for flora and fauna from being able to have restored and conserved ecosystems on the coast, and also potential migration pathways inland as sea levels continue to rise. There's increased flooding and coast erode. Next slide, please.
Okay, I just want to remind you of the time too. Thanks.
Yes, thanks. So I'll just conclude things and round them out with all of the information that I've talked about is captured in the toolkit and over 70 case studies that we're adding to on a monthly basis to support peer learning and discussion around managed retreat. We have 17 of these case studies that we capture in more depth in a report that you see on your screen, including some of the case studies that have been covered throughout the forum. So I encourage you to take a look at that. Next slide. So thank you for your time, and I encourage you to check out the Managed Retreat Toolkit. And if you have checked it out and you're familiar with it, as I said, it's a living resource that will be updated over time. So please continue to check back. And if you have any feedback or questions, feel free to post your questions in the chat box or reach out to me after today's session. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Katie. And now I'm going to welcome Don.
Good morning, everybody. I'm speaking to you this morning from Alaska, so it is indeed still morning, and we're up in the double-digit temperatures today. Next slide, please. So I work for an organization called the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, and ANTHC is a partner in the statewide tribal health network, provides healthcare services for American Indian and Alaska Native peoples. ANTHC's role in that is that we operate a hospital and provide tertiary medical services as well as trauma services. One of the things that makes us a little bit unique is attached to that healthcare facility is we have an environmental health and engineering department. And essentially the philosophy behind having this environmental health and engineering services is that if we are not able to address the environmental issues that are driving disease and illnesses in our patients and stakeholders, we won't be able to achieve our mission of Alaska Native peoples being the healthiest people in the world. Next, please. So in our environmental health department, we do the design and construction of sanitation and health facilities, and we also have a community environmental health department. And I'm nested in that department. And we're in the process of trying to develop a climate change management team that can provide technical support to communities in Alaska that are dealing with environmental threats. Next, please. Prior to my stint at the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, I did a 4-year detail to the DENALI Commission. The DENALI Commission is an independent federal agency that was established a little more than 20 years ago by Congress with a mission of promoting economic development in rural Alaska with a specific focus on infrastructure development. Now, although our funding, or the DENALI Commission's funding, is provided directly from Congress, investment decisions are made by a board of directors that's made up of 7 Alaskans. And those board of directors become a commissioner at the DENALI Commission because they are the incumbent of specifically identified positions in Alaska. For instance, the governor and/or his or her designee is a commissioner. The president of the University of Alaska is also a commissioner. So we have Alaskans that guide the investment decisions made by the DENALI Commission. Historical investments have included investments in housing, transportation, bulk fuel facilities, health facilities, and then most recently in infrastructure protection. In 2016, the Commission launched a new program that we call the Environmental Threat Community Program, specifically to aid communities that were dealing with environmental threats. Next slide, please. This is a little bit of information on different efforts that have been made in order to quantify the magnitude of environmental threats in Alaska. In 2015-16, the EPA did a study to evaluate the impacts of climate change on public infrastructure throughout Alaska, and they concluded that the magnitude is about $5.5 billion in investments by the end of the century. Now, this study was based upon existing and publicly available data on infrastructure, and that data on infrastructure in rural communities in Alaska doesn't exist. And so I think this number misses out the cost of impacts on rural community infrastructure, and specifically tribal communities. A couple of years ago, the University of Alaska at Anchorage Institute for Social and Environmental Research completed a study, and they estimated that the annual cost was going to be $50 to $100 million a year to protect and relocate rural communities. And then this past year at ANTHC, we provided some assistance to the BIA to answer a congressional request. Congress specifically asked the BIA, what is the cost of the impact of climate change on Native American communities? We put together a methodology for estimating the cost in Alaska. We estimated a total need in 144 communities throughout Alaska of about $3.45 billion to protect the infrastructure. And that included both protect in place solutions and relocation and or managed retreat. As part of that, we estimated that we needed about $32 million over the next 5 years to do more detailed community-specific vulnerability assessments. So the reality is at this point in time, we haven't analyzed the specific threats in enough detail for communities to make informed decisions about what their response will be. Next, please. This table shows what the DENALI Commission investments have been in infrastructure protection or environment threatened communities over the 4+ years that the program has functioned. It's been an average investment of about $5 million a year. About 80% of that investment has gone into 4 communities that were deemed to be the most threatened, including Newtok. The majority of the investments went to Newtok to jumpstart their relocation from their threatened village location to a new, safer spot. In 2018, the Commission got a one-time $15 million plus up that really helped to move the needle there in Newtok. But what I wanted to illustrate here is that although the DENALI Commission is not the sole funder, there are other investments from the state of Alaska and multiple federal agencies. The amount of funding that is currently being provided towards this issue is estimated to be less than 20% of the total need. Next, please. So, a couple of lessons learned or challenges that were identified in my time at the DENALI Commission and working together with the community of Newtok to try to help them to relocate is this. So the DENALI Commission program was established based on a presidential announcement. In 2015, Obama came to Alaska and he announced that the DENALI Commission was going to lead the federal charge to aid communities with climate change impacts. But that announcement didn't come with any new authorities or any new funding. And so we were very limited by the available funding that we had. To note that even though we made great successes in beginning to relocate Newtok and get some people out of harm's way, there's still 2/3 of that community that is at the endangered location. And there's no clear path right now for removing the remaining population from Newtok to the new site at Matarvik. And then second, even though we were tasked to coordinate with other federal agencies, there's no specific requirement or top-down directions for other agencies to engage in this climate resilience effort. Now, I must say that in Alaska, the engagement of federal agencies was great, and that was primarily driven by some work that the state of Alaska did at the Division of Community and Regional Affairs, where Sally Cox over there at the organization hosted some regular agency coordination meetings, and everyone came to the table and was very interested in participating, but continued to be inhibited by the funding wall. You know, we did not have sufficient funding or funding that had the right authorities in order to be able to move things along. And then also in that that ad hoc meeting of federal and state entities, you know, there was no defined participation and or specific responsibility. So those assignments were made kind of on an ad hoc basis. And, you know, when we know how that works, usually if you're late to the meeting or you don't come to a particular meeting, you get the assignment. So now, that being said, you know, although the DENALI Commission was not greatly successful at coordinating the federal efforts, we did bring some funding to the table that proved to be very valuable. So the DENALI Commission funding wasn't in one of those very specific program silos. DENALI Commission funding can be utilized for any type of relocation need of the community. And so therefore, we were able to direct our funding towards priority community needs rather than specifically to a housing effort or a transportation effort. Next slide, please.
Okay, and just want to be mindful of time.
I'm sorry, I did. Okay. So just, I'm going to run through this quickly. So one of the big challenges that we have is a lack of a national strategy. You know, there's been a lot of discussion about the Stafford Act, which directs our emergency response. Stafford Act doesn't specifically address the type of slow-moving disasters of erosion or permafrost degradation that we're seeing in Alaska. But I'm not sure that we want the Stafford Act actually to be able to address these, because we would like to be able to address the threats in Alaska as mitigation as opposed to emergency response. We have significant data deficits, as I mentioned earlier. We haven't done specific analysis in individual communities in order to give them authoritative information upon which they can make decisions. And the funding magnitude of these projects is pretty significant. And we are dealing with small communities, and therefore the unit cost is higher than it would be in a larger community to implement similar projects. Excuse me. Most of the 144 communities that we're looking at in Alaska have populations that are under 1,000 people. And then in rural Alaska, our costs are even higher than they might be on a national basis because of the ruralness of communities. Next, please. Couple of program levels design. Some of these have been mentioned already. Program design. Most of the programs that we have are not designed specifically to address relocation, you know, and or managed retreat type projects. So the result of that is that we have individual program managers who are trying to make their program fit the needs as best as possible. So we have kind of we don't have a very steady response to these. I think that also when we are trying to accomplish this type of large-scale project, by doing it in many individual grants, we lose significant economies of scale. An example of that might be that, you know, if we're doing construction projects, there is a lot of geotechnical or subsurface information that has to be gathered. But if my funding I have is only for a housing project, I can only get the geotech subsurface information I need for those houses. I can't simultaneously gather it for all of the other projects. So we lose some cost, some economies of scale there. It's like going to a fast food restaurant and having to order your burger and your drink and your fries independently. You won't get the same benefit or the cost benefit that you would if you were to order a meal deal. Another barrier that we see that needs to be addressed is these grant-making methodologies. Typically, grants are awarded based on an application process. Now, this is a gross generalization, but what that leads to is that most of grants are awarded based on ability to write grants, as opposed to based upon some type of project need that can disadvantage small communities that don't have the capacity and or the skill set to write grants. And then many grants include some disqualifying conditions in them that make it hard for small impoverished communities, such as having some minimal non-federal matching requirements, as an example. And then agency coordination is very difficult to do. This graphic that I showed here, I stole and I'm using out of context from another publication. It wasn't intending to show how difficult the coordination is, but I think this illustrates how many different players there are and how complex it can be to coordinate that if you're having to work with individual agencies on a grant-by-grant basis. Next, please.
And Don, I'm just going to ask you to wrap it up so we can get to Robin. Sorry, running late on time.
Okay. So I would say, Justin, go ahead and skip to the next one, please. So just kind of in conclusion, I think there's 3 policy areas that we need to address. We need to identify adequate and dedicated funding for relocation and managed retreat projects. We need to develop equitable program design, and we need a system to coordinate the federal response with defined roles and responsibilities so that we can have, equitable programs and that we can meet these economies of scale. Next slide, please. And the last thing I'd like to just close with is that we do have a model for deploying whole of community efforts to address emergency response, and that's our federal framework for disaster recovery. And I think this can be a model for establishing some type of whole community response to managed retreat and relocations projects as well. So a couple of elements that are incorporated in that framework are dedicated leadership, and then there's a coordinating structure that defines multiple support functions, and within each of those support functions, like housing, sanitation, facilities, finance, there's a lead agency, and then there are coordinating agencies and other supporting agencies that are specifically defined for each of those. And then there are very defined roles and responsibilities for each. So I think that can be a good model for establishing some type of a framework with which we can approach these issues. So thank you. Sorry for running long.
Thank you, Don. Yeah, no problem. And I'm going to welcome Robin. For those of you who have to leave us at the top of the hour, just be aware we're going to send this recording out, and we'll just be going a little bit over time to do a little bit of Q&A afterwards. So thanks, Robin. We'll get you started.
Thank you, and thanks so much for the opportunity to speak on this panel today. So I'm going to focus on the community perspective of policy. Thank you so much to the previous speakers who have done a really good job of outlining the challenges. And so what we've been trying to do, I've been working on this issue of a relocation, watching New Talks process for the last 15 years. And what we've been trying to do is vision what an institutional design needs to look like, keeping people and communities first, and reviewing the current regulations and laws that need to be reframed in order to be able to respond to the climate force displacement. Next slide, please. So it's really important when I'm talking to talk about what I mean planned community relocation, because what I find is that we conflate lots of different types of population movement in relation to climate change. And this type of population movement, planned community relocation, is the type of population movement where we have no models. And so everybody's mentioned that this type of population movement needs to be voluntary. And so the focus of our work has been on that decision-making process. The reason why voluntary is such an important component, one of the reasons is because we have a horrific legacy of government-mandated relocations in this country. And Newtok, for instance, were forced to be in their current location because of the federal requirement to send children to school, and then the barge to build the school dropped off the materials at the place where Newtok currently is. So government-mandated relocations are not going to protect people, and research has shown that. The other really important part of it is that this is a long-term planning process. So Newtok has been trying to relocate for now almost, I think, over 20 years. And even without the barriers that Dawn described, it is a long-term, multi-year process because it's not just about infrastructure and building it, but also the movement of people. As a human rights attorney, I think that the protection of human rights needs to be the foundation upon which we conceive of any institutional design. And that it's about not only moving that infrastructure, as I mentioned, but making sure that people are maintaining their kinship and cultural connections as they decide, and also are able to maintain livelihoods. Next slide, please. So folks have already mentioned some of this, but in regard to the institutional design that's needed and where it is completely lacking is when. And again, this is where we have been really focused with the tribes that we are working with. At what point in time should relocation be considered the best long-term adaptation strategy? Who makes that decision and how is that decision made? And then, of course, where do people go? Where does a community decide that they want to relocate to in order to protect the things that they hold valuable to them? And as everybody has said, there is no state or federal government agency that is in charge of any of these governance issues. Next slide, please. So when I'm thinking of the relocation principles that must be based in human rights, there are already existing human rights principles that are in international legal documents. There's no one document at the international level that specifically outlines the human rights principles that need to adhere in this process. And the one that we are most focused on is the right to self-determination, which is connected to being a voluntary decision by people to protect the places where they want to go. And in that way, in protecting the right to self-determination, we're also making sure that people are able to make the decisions about their livelihoods and their cultural practices so that they will be able to continue living in a new location as they desire. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So because of the two issues that I mentioned, the when and the who in regards to this decision about relocation, we have been focused on community-based social and environmental monitoring. And we've worked with the Alaska Division of Geological and Geophysical Surveys, as well as the Woods Hole Research Center, to install community-based erosion and permafrost thaw monitoring. We also help communities document the flooding. The reason why that is so important is because what we know is climate change is not going to end at the end of this century. Certainly not at the end of the decade. And so if we're focused on vulnerability assessments where outside consultants come in and do an assessment in a snapshot in time, that is one, not empowering the community with the information and data that they need to make the decisions that they need to make in regard to the when piece. And it also helps to define the when. It's helping to document how the environmental changes are impacting community health and well-being and infrastructure. And through this work that we've done with the tribes, we identified a new hazard in our state called Ushtek, which is has been defined by our Alaska State Hazard Mitigation Plan. It's a Yupik word meaning catastrophic land collapse, and it's caused by thawing permafrost, erosion, and flooding. There's more work to do because we believe that USHTEC should be a basis for a disaster declaration. And as you can see, this is an iterative process where you are constantly monitoring the environment because it is accelerating in the Arctic at a rapid rate, and being able to respond as the environment is changing and get access to the resources that are needed. Next slide, please. So I want to highlight how social equity is missing from the current configuration of policies and laws that are in place. So if you look at FEMA's new program, the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Community Grant Program, and their guiding principles, people aren't even part of it, much less social equity. And then the GAO disaster resilience. I'm not sure how you can talk about disaster resilience without talking about people, their health and well-being, and equity. And I want to give a few examples of how we have reviewed current existing systems and policies that are not meeting the needs of the community members that we work with and could easily be changed. No need to change the law, but changing the interpretation of the law. So first, hazard mitigation planning. What we found when we were working with the tribes is that it's outside consultants, not from the community, who fly in for 3 days, hopefully, and work with the community to then fly out and write a hazard mitigation plan. We worked intensively to educate and advocate with the state and FEMA how that the hiring of outside consultants, it does not empower communities to take charge of the hazard mitigation planning process. We also highlighted the fact, and we worked with the DENALI Commission and Don on this, but unfortunately weren't able to get the funding, is hazard mitigation plans. Actually, everything related to the Stafford Act is required to be translated. It's in the law, but it's not being implemented. And so one of the things that we want to do is to take those hazard mitigation plans, which are hundreds of pages long, and reduce it to an executive summary that gets translated into the first language of the people who are living in the communities that we work with, because they are the ones who need to understand what this plan says so that it can be implemented. And then the final piece about hazard mitigation planning, so when we looked at the hazard mitigation plans for several of the tribes that we work with, all of them said that the tribe needed to continue to do community ecological monitoring, environmental monitoring of the changes that were happening in their community. But the hazard mitigation plans did not provide any information about where communities could access that funding or how to do the monitoring that they were recommending. On the disaster side, one of the things that several tribes mentioned to us is that when a disaster occurs, their fish camps are not eligible to receive disaster assistance. There's no basis in that for the law. The law has been interpreted to mean that you can only get disaster relief funding if the place that has been impacted is close to your residence. And fish camps often are not close to people's residences, and this lack of ability to get access to the funding for fish camps radically impacts the ability of that community, that family, potentially to be able to feed their families. So we have been working hard advocating with the tribes to FEMA and the state to change their interpretation of these laws, because those changes could help us build the capacity to create this institutional design of when relocation needs to be considered and empowering the communities with the information they need to make that decision. Next slide, please. And so our work has really focused on bringing the tribes together so that they are constantly sharing their expertise with each other on how they respond to disasters, how they have responded to moving the infrastructure or the need to move infrastructure in their community to be safe, because they have the knowledge and wisdom to move their communities forward in a way that protects their communities. And what they need is access to the funding and technical assistance so that they can make those strategies be implemented. Next slide. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robin. And at this point, I'm going to invite all of the presenters back on to just do a quick Q&A. I think given what Robin was proposing, some potential equity solutions to these challenges, I want to kind of open it up to the rest of the panel as well to just say, what is one priority change that you would like to see made to either state, local, or federal policies that will make the most difference in your eyes? And I'm going to have Katie start with us because I know she has to jump off.
Thanks for the question, Molly. I think for me, especially at the state and local level, which is where my work is focused, is really jurisdiction-based, so it's going to vary. I think the biggest step, though, that state and local governments and the federal government and communities can take is just to start talking about retreat and having it not be a foregone post-disaster response, so they can start integrating things like that into their laws and policies and plans. And also, again, not looking at it as sort of this new concept that where did it come from, but really thinking about things, for example, in land use law or coastal management regulations like setbacks or zoning, and reducing or increasing density where you want to try and encourage or discourage people to go that have already been on the table. So look at what you already have on the books. Might enable or make it easier to start having these discussions with policymakers and communities.
Thank you. Carlos, how about you? What do you think?
Sure. I'm going to cheat and give you two. So the number one is, I think there has to be some set of just conscious principles by which we decide what is viable versus a community that should potentially relocate. And those principles should be based on sort of what are the triggers, what are the environmental and social conditions that would potentially necessitate some discussion about relocation. But probably the most important of those principles would be, so this is my second one, community engagement, community self-determination around what should be their fate. In many cases, we've actually seen people, communities want to move and have discussions about how they should move. So that has to be grounded in everything we do. Just to be short, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks so much, Carlos. Okay, Micah, what do you think is a priority change? Go ahead.
I think it's really just about being proactive and just sort of helping these communities sort of recognize the problem and then empowering them to make the necessary changes they need to make to just have the information they need to do proactive decision making on whether they need to relocate. And I think that's sort of similar to what the other panelists have said, but I would say that would be the biggest thing that I would like to see changed. So.
And Joe, do you want to bounce off that for GAO?
Yeah, I think the main priority change from the perspective of GAO is exactly what we recommended in our report, and that's to create a federal pilot program with the authority to coordinate and direct federal efforts in a coherent way, and also fund migration projects that in areas where people are ready to move. And we don't have that now. That's one of the main things that everybody pointed out. And it's time that we did something about that as a federal government. We don't know exactly how it would work or what it would look like, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And that's why we recommended the pilot program.
Thanks, Joe. All right, Don, how about you?
right now, communities in Alaska that have decided to relocate are having to approach that by putting together a mix of likely hundreds of different grants from federal agencies in order to accomplish that relocation. It's not possible to do a relocation that way. It may be possible to fund protect and place solutions using, individual federal grants, but not a relocation or managed retreat. For everybody that has got some new experience doing puzzles during their time at home, with COVID, I mean, imagine trying to put together that jigsaw puzzle if you didn't have the picture painted on top of it. And that's kind of what the effort is like for communities who are trying to identify various federal funding sources to do this. So I think we need some dedicated funding sources, and we need to have some, equity in our grant-making process so that small impoverished communities can compete.
Thanks, Don. And Robin, what do you think out of those proposed solutions you mentioned? What are your priority change?
Well, I think, so I recognize the challenges with relocation, and that is critically important. But again, I am really focused on when, because if we don't identify the when, then it's going to be really hard for communities to do the intense work, even with a coordinated federal government strategy, to relocate. So I want, those policies that I mentioned with hazard mitigation planning, that's required for all communities in the United States who want to access FEMA, and it is an underutilized planning process that really needs to focus on communities, because what I hear outside of Alaska is that it is not engaging with communities even though it's supposed to. And then doing this community-based environmental monitoring, that is essential because it's accelerating. The environmental changes that are happening are accelerating, and we've got to create an iterative, dynamic process.
Thank you, Robin. And I just have one more question, and then I think the remaining questions I will ask the panelists in written form and send them out with a later on with the recording. But I'm wondering, how do you think is the best way to get these changes on the agenda of decision makers? What is the best way to push these forward?
Well, I think communities need to want this, because my experience, so when I first started working, I was a PhD student following New Talk's process, and I remember the Immediate Action Work Group was a group of hard-working federal and state government officials who in the beginning didn't even want to use the word relocation because we have such a horrific legacy of that in the United States. And, and most countries, including the U.S., don't want to manage the internal movement of people, right? So until communities are saying this is what we need, because in the GAO report, there are hardly any communities that are asking for this now. So if we're not going to do relocation, we've got to do protection in place and put the funding there so people are protected where they are.
Thank you. Do we have anyone else who has a suggestion?
I would just say that to echo Robin, the communities have to have elected officials that support their determination. And they're advocating for their inclusion in the discussions. So that includes picking and electing elected officials that are going to support any kind of conversation, which is a timely conversation that we're having today.
One quick point I'll add too. Go ahead.
You go ahead, Katie.
Really quick, is to get politicians to get on their agenda to think long-term and beyond independent election cycles where they're worried about getting reelected versus helping the communities that are advancing these types of considerations. So thinking with longer-term mindset.
Yeah, and I'll build on that. I mean, you do that by building institutions that have the long-term perspective. And we've recommended the creation of that type of institution to provide top-down cover for sort of local decision-making. and we will continue to work with congressional staff on potential legislation as the interest exists.
I would like to add that I think that it's all correct. That's how we need to continue talking about it and keep the message out in the forefront. But I think we also need to keep in mind the point that Robin brought up about the timing, as we have communities in Alaska that are now facing an existential threat, and they don't have all of the time that it might take for that kind of process to work out. One of the ways we had some success at the DENALI Commission is communicating the message. We're actually getting decision makers out on the ground, boots on the ground, walking around in the mud. And I found that was a pretty effective way for communicating. So that would be one thing I would recommend, as much as possible, to get our decision makers out on the ground in these at-risk communities to rapidly communicate the message.
I just want to add that I think, this kind of goes back to the pilot program. There needs to be something that demonstrates a success story, or shows that this can be done in an effective manner. And going back to what everybody's been saying, all of these like scenarios up to this point that have been, almost nightmares, until somebody demonstrates that this can be done well, and that there's like a systematic way of going about it that can be effective and meet everybody's needs. It's going to be a challenge. So.
I appreciate that. Robin, it looked like you had one more thing you wanted to add. Is that, or did,
I was
did they answer?
Do a shout out to Dawn and the DENALI Commission, because Dawn worked so hard at the DENALI Commission to get the funding to move 1/3 of the community, and I know it was a giant effort to make that happen. And it was unrestricted funding. So the DENALI Commission got unrestricted funding that the DENALI Commission was then able to fill the gaps in where the cost share requirements needed to be met. And that's how 1/3 of the community got to be safe.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, all of you, for our panelists, for what you presented today, and for staying a little later for Q&A. I do want to, for those still on the line, I just want to remind you to look out for the recordings, not only of this session, but the other sessions of the Climate Displacement Forum. We'll be sending that out in the coming weeks, along with the additional resources we discussed today. And finally, looking ahead, next year we're going to be hosting the next round of Global Adaptation Month. So if you have any displacement or retreat related goals on your mind right now, I recommend thinking about that, making a commitment to implementing that in your own community. Finally, I hope that you all can join us at our virtual networks for future discussions relating to climate displacement and other adaptation issues. And I just want to say once again, thank you all for joining us, and I wish you all the safety and health possible in the coming weeks. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Molly.
Thank you.